Welcome, everyone, to the Quality of Life Prescription Podcast, a podcast about longevity, functional medicine, and just healthy aging. I'm joined today by Dr. Neela Sandel, and I'm Dr. Dan Horzempa. Welcome, everyone, to the Quality of Life Prescription Podcast. We are talking today about senescence and just longevity and aging in general. Again, I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Neela Sandel. And so, Neela, I was thinking maybe we start with just talking about some of these hallmarks of aging, and then we kind of zoom in on senescence. I think that's the one that we're really going to try to cover today. How does that sound?
I think that sounds awesome. And we may also just add a little bit of general background for people. There might be some people who aren't quite familiar with where we are at in longevity science. I think it's pretty stunning for a lot of the general population.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. And certainly, I have the hallmarks of aging here. I had to write them down because certainly naming all nine off the top of your head, and especially considering they're continuing to add more and more of them, can be a challenge. But I can read them out for everyone.
And then let's take it. Sounds cool.
Yeah. So number one is genomic instability. Two is telomere attrition. Three is epigenetic alterations. Four is loss of proteostasis. Five is deregulated nutrient sensing. Six is mitochondrial dysfunction. Seven is cellular senescence. Eight is stem cell exhaustion. And nine is altered intercellular communication. And there are four additional ones that I think have been proposed. I'm not quite sure of the general agreement in the scientific community on these, but for completeness sake, I'll read them out as well. Compromised autophagy, microbiome disturbance, altered mechanical properties, and inflammation.
Those are good additions.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a lot for probably a lot of people to chew on. Maybe we should go through and kind of just maybe say a brief little bit about each of those. The general concept there, of course, is that when we think about aging, there are things that contribute to age, right? Age is literally just a number. It's not a biological reality, right? I think everybody who's listening realizes that there are 80-year-olds who can't get out of a couch, and there are other 80-year-olds who are up on top of Everest, right? And so that collection of 8 decades isn't actually aging. Aging is a collection of breakdowns of homeostasis, right? And those 13 things are all particular ideas. And I really like that approach, Dan, because one of the things that's unique about the type of medicine that you and I do is that we try to bring back the nuance, right? In mainstream medicine, it's quite direct. It's quite, forgive the phrase, dumbed down, not to disparage other MDs, but they are quite linear in the way they think about problem solving. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I think that then goes out to the public and they start saying, oh, well, I'm 70. Of course I feel bad. It's like, well, no, hang on. Let's bring back in the nuance. Let's look at these 13 different categories specific for you. And, you might be 70 years old on one of those, 65 on another, 55 on another, and so on and so on. And so we get to have so much fun. Basically, I've been saying play whack-a-mole with those. It's like, okay, yeah. What's aging you particularly? What is the low-hanging fruit in your biology? Really cool to kind of break that all down into those 13 concepts.
Yeah, great point. I mean, I think also it's important that although we're reading out 13 different, hallmarks here, they're all interrelated. Right. There's certain ones that are driving other ones, so we're going to talk about senescence today, but there's other things on that list, like, DNA damage, mitochondrial dysfunction that are driving cellular senescence. So it's important to keep in mind that this is like a spider web of cause and effect here. It's all contributing. We have this phenotype then of aging, but then we have all these hallmarks that are playing off of one another, and then eventually adding up to a sum of what aging is.
Right. Yeah. So, Dan, is this the sort of thing that you encourage people to think about themselves, or is this something that reaches a layer of complexity that they really need a doc for?
I mean, I think at this point, a lot of times this is something that we start to go into maybe by looking at the hallmarks that are individual to that person. It's also important to say here that we can't measure all of these hallmarks perfectly. We can measure some really well, like inflammation. Other ones we can't measure, quite as well. The loss of proteostasis, nutrient deregulation, those kinds of things.
Yeah, we end up relying a lot on indirect markers, right? And I
Yeah,
think that's an awesome point, Dan. I like to think that people can engage in these things generally with themselves. And one of the things that fascinates me about longevity science is that um, a lot of the starting places for all of these are kind of things that people already recognize. Like, yes, there's all this like minutia and data and tracking that one can do, but a lot of the times the interventions are kind of duh. You like a lot of people are like, oh yeah, of course I should exercise more vigorously. Yes, I should. I think now it's become quite trendy, even the lay populace, to do hot cold cycles. So people are kind of like, yeah, I could engage with those myself. But to your point, it's like, if we can get data on them, that takes it to an entirely different level.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, also if we're talking about maybe it's not a bad time to introduce that there are biological clocks out there of many different types.
Yeah.
Most of them are epigenetic, methylation clocks, essentially, looking at methylation and demethylation patterns and trying to, with the good clocks, trying to match that up with what the biological age looks like of the person, similar to kind of counting like rings of a tree kind of thing.
That's what I think about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's more functional markers. Like I said, VO2 max is something we're doing in the clinic now that, produces more of a functional biological age metric.
Yeah.
So
Oh, that's awesome. So what do you think, Dan? Should we dig into senescence? I think we've kind of introduced the concept of longevity. I mean, it's all fun. There's so much that we can get into, and I suppose we're probably victim to time constraints and maybe attention constraints.
yeah. Yeah, I think senescence, it's a good place to jump in. There's a lot of interest. There's a lot of supplement companies coming out with senolytics, and we'll talk about what those
Yeah, yeah, seriously.
are.
Yeah.
But it's, the basically senescence as it's defined is the cell gets to a limit of replication. It's not stops replicating. And but it doesn't die, essentially. So these are cells that are in a stable cell cycle arrest, meaning that they're still carrying on the processes of a normal cell, but they're no longer replicating. And there's a lot of theory as to why this senescence happen, but it's probably happening because it's a damaged cell. It's a cell that has DNA damage, has mitochondrial damage, and it's the body's way of saying, let's not replicate, a cell that is not a healthy cell.
Right. I mean, that's certainly a cancer risk along a lot of other potential trouble.
Yeah. 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 The cancer side is really interesting because, we can talk about, there's good things with senescent cells and bad things. Obviously there's embryologic things with senescent cells rather, that are necessary in embryologic development. The cancer side, there's good and bad there, certainly, because there's some evidence that senescent cells are protecting against cancer, right? They're non-dividing. Whereas the hallmark of cancer cells is malignant transformation. I mean, they just divide and divide and divide. So the cancer side kind of can go both ways because there does seem to be risk with cancer there as well. And then there's things like wound healing, which surprised me to hear that senescence is even a part of that. So it's
You want
doing
to talk
good
about
things.
that a little bit? Because that is interesting.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, it's interesting. It's just these anywhere that the body can, it's useful for the body to have a cell that's not going to continue to divide, but will still function. That's kind of the purpose of these cells. So in wound healing, it turns out that there's a function of wound healing that it's really helpful to have senescent cells involved. Um, like I said, there's disease trends too that go with senescent cells. Alzheimer's. So, I mean, basically all your major diseases that kill humans. Alzheimer's and neurodegeneration, cancer, cardiovascular disease.
Well, and that's why it makes the list of the big 13, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and it's funny, like you'd mentioned earlier, the spider web approach, right? And a senescent cell has shared characteristics with all these other 13 elements, right? It's like, well, why has a cell become senescent? Well, there's all sorts of other potential causes of damage that is not reparable from those 12 other that then inform this. And so there is just this constant communication back and forth among those different 13 things, which uh, keeps us able to geek out and learning and pushing the science and being, okay, what are the connections here that haven't been established yet? And I think for anybody listening, you guys probably already realize this. This is a completely growing field. I mean, this is the Wild West. There's a lot of speculation. Like Dan was saying, we don't even have great measures for a lot of these things. And the things that we have that are measures are probably almost certainly incomplete. They're imperfect. And so we still are slave to a lot of assumptions in
Yeah.
this field for sure. Yeah, totally awesome. Very interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's also, important to point out to people that there's also a microenvironment issue with these senescent cells. In other words, there's this term SASP, which I'm sure you've probably heard, which is this senescence associated secretory phenotype, which just means all the inflammatory cytokines, I kind of think of it as like, when you see a car with like a tailpipe with a bunch of black stuff coming out, it's all that, it's all that badness kind of coming out of
like
this.
that car is due for the junkyard. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And it's the same thing here. So yeah, so it's interesting that, it's changing kind of the microenvironment, and that maybe that's why there's all these disease associations too.
Right.
Certainly, inflammation is a big player here as well.
I heard these described once as zombie cells, and I quite liked that. It carries
Yeah.
that sort of connotation of like they're both perpetual and dysfunctional, and they cause irritation to everything around them. The
Yeah.
sort of stuck, gnarly, I think about like a locust tree. You're like, come on, locust tree. Like, why are you in this environment? You're just making everybody's life hard. Big giant spines on them. Like, come on.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
part of the ecosystem, right? But it's not everyone's favorite part.
Yeah. 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 That's a good point. Yeah. So it's important that, we kind of established, I mean, it's complicated. I think it's complicated as it is with all of these hallmarks of aging for sure. And one thing that seems to be a potential here is that maybe when we're younger, having a few senescent cells may not be the worst thing. But as we get older and they accumulate to larger and larger, volumes, and there's more and more of them, maybe that's when there's a threshold where they cross over and really start to become a problem.
Yeah, well, that microenvironment starts to become the macro environment at some tipping point, right? It's
Yeah.
like, okay, it's not that I just have, one of these cars with a smoked out tailpipe. Everyone on the road has this, and it's starting to get smoggy around here.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
So, what else should we say about senescence? I mean, we can talk about how we see this clinically. I bet people will be very interested to know, do I have senescent cells? How might I notice that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, certainly we know that just looking at someone, and as we, accumulate, photo damage and wrinkles and things as we age, some of that is senescence. Senescence happens in every tissue. And when it happens in the skin, that's when we get some of these, just things we would recognize as skin age.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So, I mean, in some way, it can be as easy as just looking in the mirror from that to
Yeah.
look at that tissue, certainly. So,
And it's interesting, right? Like everybody's going to have senescent cells to some degree. Even young people are going to have some senescent cells.
yeah.
And everyone at the age are going to collect more senescent cells. And when someone is trying to figure out, okay, well, how do I optimize my longevity? I think a very natural question is, well, to what degree should I focus on senescence? Senescence is part of the problem, but how much of it is my problem? right? And then we can bridge into, what do we actually do about the darn thing? And this is where, for me, it gets into that realm of, like I was saying earlier, a lot of the interventions are kind of obvious or things that people have heard about before. And so someone might be querying, well, do I have senescent cells and what do I do about it? Well, a lot of the initial first line things we might do about it are the things you do for many of the other 13 elements. And so it's like you don't almost have to identify senescence. You can assume you have it. And then you can apply longevity protocols to try and minimize the rate at which you create more of them. So maybe then, and correct me if I'm missing a logical step here, but maybe we should talk about what specifically we can do then to target senescent cells as kind of something more specific to them rather than all the other great longevity stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea. And I think there's interventions across the board in the supplement realm, in the drug realm, and in the lifestyle realm. So maybe starting with some of the lifestyle stuff.
Yeah. Always the
And
most accessible.
yeah, and so certainly probably one of the most cost-effective, accessible things that all of us can do to lower senescent cells is fasting, right?
Yeah.
Which makes a lot of sense. Certainly, like senescent cells are not necessarily the best functioning cells, and the body, when we do fasting, the body will, basically be looking to break down cells to use their components, to use the amino acids. So senescent cells are kind of on the chopping block
Right.
from that perspective. A lot of times I explain it to patients like it's a company, and you're
Mm.
having kind of underperforming, employees, overperforming employees, and then something happens with the company. They're going through hard times. They have to make.
Right.
It's the same with the body with fasting.
Yeah, and that's cool, right? Like fasting as a concept is something that everyone has heard of, and probably most people don't ever really engage in. I know that intermittent fasting is perhaps trendy right now, but longer fasts are quite unusual, I think, among the general population in the West. They're almost thought of as more of a spiritual practice than something for our physical health. One thing that fascinates me, me, sorry, I'm going to get off my tangent here, but right, basically all wisdom traditions prescribed fasting, right? You look at the Bible, you look at the Quran, you look at the Vedas, yada yada yada. It's always there's some discussion about the potency of fasting. Now, they're oftentimes talking about the clarification of the mind, but we also know that clarification of the mind is in many ways synonymous with the reduction of brain fog. And brain fog, in many ways, is caused by inflammation. And so there's a very clear link of, well, okay, of course, we're an integrated unit, right? Our spiritual self, consciousness, our psychological self, our biological self are all intertwined. So yeah, fasting is absolutely fascinating, and the fact that it's so accessible and cheaper than free, right? You don't even have to pay for food, right?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah, one of the most cost-effective interventions. So, and I think fasting is probably a good example too, that it's one intervention, it's touching multiple hallmarks though. So, and I think a lot of the lifestyle interventions are going to kind of fall under this category too, where we'll see one intervention. You used exercise earlier, which certainly is another great example. Exercise touches multiple hallmarks, but it's one intervention.
Yeah.
So,
So let's dig into fasting maybe a little bit. Maybe give people some protocols, some technicals, kind of help them feel empowered to maybe play with this themselves. I think it's certainly worth a disclaimer, right? Fasting is a delicate process, and you should always be mindful of your own limits, particularly if you have blood sugar issues, any history of diabetes, pre-diabetes. You have to be a little extra careful with those things because the body might have lost its ability to regulate those things quite as easily.
yeah.
Fasting's pretty intense, Dan. Have you played with that much yourself personally?
Quite a bit. I mean, quite a bit. I mean, certainly once your kids start to get older, it becomes more challenging as they, because it's tough to explain it to there's probably an age in the teenage years where you could explain it and they'd be like, okay, I kind of get that. But before that, they just kind of are like, why is daddy not eating kind of thing. So,
Like, well,
maybe,
senescent cells.
yeah, I got to explain to them about senescent cells, but I think there are interventions probably that have similar effects to fasting, even though you're still eating a low caloric, low
Mm.
protein amount. So the fasting mimicking diet, for instance, because I think a lot of this, like the autophagy and the senescence, when we talk about fasting, those two are so related. We're looking to
Right.
activate autophagy, which will then decrease senescent cells.
And
And
autophagy, guys, just comes from the Greek auto meaning self and phagy meaning eating. So that's the company doing layoffs, right? It's looking for the weak cells to say, hey, let's just munch that. Let's put that in the fuel tank because we're running dry.
exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So how long does it take to get an effect with this? I've certainly heard different figures. I have some that I stick to, and ultimately, I just think of it like a siege. You get the more effects the longer you hold the siege. And when you're thinking about longevity, it seems like there's a sweet spot to fasting.
Yeah.
What's been your experience with that?
Yeah, I think, I mean, from my working with patients, following the literature on this, there's some discussion in the literature of chaperone mediated autophagy, which they sometimes just call deep autophagy, meaning that we're just really, really cleaning house on a deeper level. We do get autophagy activated to some degree, even in non-fasted states. It's important to say exercise will activate autophagy, but it seems like 72 hours on fasting is
Yeah.
about the sweet spot for really getting into that deep autophagy.
And that's when we get into it,
Yeah.
right? And then it's like, well, the longer we can hold that, the more we're cleaning house. And in my experience, both personally and professionally, um, I mean, fasting is very disruptive to your life. Like you were saying, your kids are going, Dad, what's going on over here? But also, it's just hard to be functional. So if you're thinking about doing a 3-day fast or a 4-day fast or a 5-day fast, which is personally where I kind of, and professionally, I kind of say, okay, that's usually pretty good. If you get to 5 days, that's plenty. You will have been in that chaperone mediated autophagy for a while.
Yeah.
Um, that kind of wrecks your week. it's yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty hard to get anything beyond a sort of token exercise in your professional functionality, your cognitive function. At least for myself, I find myself to be very is distractible the right term? I mean, it's hard to want to do anything. It's pretty much your activity for the day.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely agree with that. I mean, I think there's probably a sweet spot where you're staying busy enough to not think about food, but you're not
Distractibility,
too
yeah,
busy that you're, overly taxing yourself.
yeah,
And I've definitely, over the years, you just kind of got to play with that, and
right.
for me, for a lot of years, I just thought the busier I could be that week, the better. But, eventually, started, tumbling into that. Oh, okay, this is really, I'm way too busy to
Yeah,
really be able to fast during this kind of week. But there does seem to be a middle sweet spot, at least from my own
yeah.
experience.
Well, and also, personally, one of the things that I really like about fasting is that mental clarity, the sort of consciousness clarity. Like in Ayurveda, we think about pranayama being a way to stop bodily functions so that we can more tightly engage with consciousness. So basically, meditation becomes substantially easier. And fasting, in my experience, is very, very analogous to that. We stop our digestive processes. We literally don't have to spend time cooking or eating, and it's actually an awesome time to just get into hermitage retreat meditation, kind of. And again, you have young kids, it's much more challenging obviously, but it's definitely a cool state. Anybody who goes through the longevity trouble of doing that, I would highly recommend, especially on the third, fourth, and fifth days, try to find some time just to get into your spirituality, because you've already done the hard work. You may as well get all the benefits you can from being there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, and it's also important to say sometimes when you reach that day 3, day 4 mark, you got ketones
Yeah,
at 3, 4, 5,
evens
really
out.
high, steady ketone levels. And you may be feeling a lot better. It's
Yeah.
often the first couple days when your body's trying to make that switch over to, kind of fat burning, producing ketones. This is why it can also be helpful to, do a ketogenic diet leading into a
Mm.
fast. you
Yeah,
know.
that's a great point. So anybody who's having a hard time getting into that, and I completely agree, Dan. The first 2 days are by a mile the hardest, and then you kind of go, yeah, okay. I'm not ultra functional, but I'm not suffering. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's a great idea to build into it. And even if people want to practice with intermittent fasting, it's still just training that. It's okay to build up to that 3, 4, 5 day fast. You don't have to just go cold turkey on food, out of the blue. Your body might say something about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's important to say too, I tell this to patients, like sometimes if you don't want to jump straight into water fasting, um, start with a fasting mimetic type of diet, like the type developed by Walter Longo, which is usually 5 days. It's generally 1,100, 1,200 calories the first day, 700 or 800 calories in that range for the next 4 days after that. You're staying low protein, and you're probably getting a lot of those same benefits. I mean, he's done both human trials and mouse trials here that show, okay, you're turning over, some of the organ turnover here is amazing, especially in mice. As you can imagine, like, 5 days is a much longer time frame for them,
Mhm. Yeah.
but they're turning over, large volumes of different organs. Not all organs. I mean, I think if I remember correctly, like heart and lungs are pretty spared,
Uh,
as maybe brain. But you're definitely seeing that autophagy occur,
yeah.
and they're
Yeah.
they're even seeing it with immune cell turnover. Where the immune
Uh,
cells are turning over as well. So I think that that's enough evidence for me to tell someone you're going to get a lot of benefit. You're definitely going to get autophagy here.
yeah.
Um, and you're probably going to get 80% or maybe even more of the benefits as if you did a water fast. And it's probably going to be more tolerable for you. Just have people eating like a big salad twice a day and, some olives, some almonds, something like that. It can be really simple.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, you said something that sparked some curiosity in me, and I'm gonna drag us kicking and screaming into the realm of speculation here. But you were talking about autophagy's turnover of immune cells. Have you ever seen anything about fasting and autophagy for autoimmunity?
Yeah. Yeah. Actually,
What do you know about that?
some of the same studies that Walter Longo did. I mean, you got to give it to him. He's really tried to work with medicine. He's tried to, go into hospitals, work with oncologists, work with, physicians to really try to get some human data here, because certainly like fasting is just full of animal data, right? Um,
Uh-huh.
it's
Yeah.
just a ton of animal data. So you're often kind of, looking for some of that human data. And you really got to give it to him.
Yeah, I mean
He's
that's a lot of labor emotionally, trying to interact with physicians who don't perhaps jump at the concept.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why. I mean, he's developed these kits. I don't know if you've seen these Prolon kits.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
Portland's great. Yeah.
and certainly, that can be a really easy thing, shows up in the mail. I will sometimes like, send patients versions, like whole food versions of a similar way to do it. But, the Prolon can also be a really easy way to do it too. And I imagine like when you're working in hospital settings with physicians, being able to show up with 15 Prolon boxes,
Mhm.
for a group of patients is probably that's got to make it easier on that front, I imagine.
Yeah. Cool, cool. So but to kind of dig into that just for half a second more, and then I'll
Sure.
release us from the dark, shady realm of speculation and novel science.
Yeah.
What is his data on autoimmunity? Does he have data on patients, on human patients for autoimmunity?
Yeah, I believe he does. And I think that
That's
what they
awesome.
find is there is kind of preferential removal of some of the autoimmune cells themselves.
That's
Um,
wild.
yeah. So depending on, I can't remember, it's been a long time since I've looked at these, but so I can't remember if they're looking specifically at like T cells or more B cell mediated. But
Mhm.
what they found was like each subsequent fasting cycle, there would be less and less of the actual autoimmune
Uh,
cells, immune
fascinating.
cells themselves.
So to kind of go back to one of our initial theses here, the people are going to be wondering, well, how do I know if I need to do things? And senescence, we are all going to assume that we have some senescence. The more decades we have, probably the more senescent cells, generally speaking. But one clear sign that we're getting into trouble that would be benefited by longevity interventions like fasting is if people have autoimmune dysfunctions, right? And there's some conceptual crossovers between autoimmune cells and these senescent cells in generally that they are cells that become dysfunctional and don't get turned over. Why are we engaging in that behavior in a way that is contrary to our larger biology, right? And so it's kind of back to your point about the spider web, right? It's all interconnected. Fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, you really have to, because we evolved in a low food environment, and we would, I mean, I don't think it was called fasting back then. I think it was called partial starvation.
Winter.
Yeah. So, and that's the environment we evolved in. You have to wonder if some of these protective mechanisms that occur, with fasting are just kind of built into the system and meant to be used, and we're just underutilized.
Yeah. Yeah. I get that. I get that sense about seasonal eating a lot. In Ayurveda, we think a lot about eating locally, and that's not a sort of trendy ecological concept. It's a pinning of your native biological needs to the things that are local to you, and also mediated by the cycle of seasons. So again, there's so much like, and sorry to derail a little bit here, but there's so much in our new science that's coming up that indicates over and over again that the further we move from our native adaptations, the more health issues we have. Like blue light is something that I'm seeing a lot of actually good science finally coming out on. And people are starting to do a great job of really pinning this down and pointing out the significance with, actual studies now on how that modifies things. So I'll not go too far into a tangent there, but of course, going back to the spider web, this all plays into that. And I bring it up purely because one of my favorite ways to think about longevity and health in general is thinking about what our ancestors did, because we're just adapted for that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. And I think, there's going back to senescent cells, there's even evidence that probably ketogenic diets, beta hydroxybutyrate, may play a role with activating clearance of senescent cells also. It's all the same pathway we're talking about. I mean, as you know, the ketogenic diet was really developed as a way to mimic some of the effects of fasting. And so I think it's all going through those same mechanisms. But you have to imagine that, outside of really extreme examples, of like equatorial populations or like Arctic populations, we were cycling through a wide variety of food throughout the year. We were probably getting a lot more carbohydrate in the summer, fruit, honey, everything's available then, probably a lot less in the winter, more fat, protein, less of the ripe fruits available, things like that. So yeah, I mean, it makes sense.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so to get us back on track after I dragged us out into the wilderness. so so senescence, we've talked about how to identify if we may have senescence, who's likely to have senescence. We've talked about one major lifestyle modification that people can do to attack senescence and improve their longevity. What else?
I mean, I think it's important to cover some of the supplements because I'm seeing a lot of that.
Oh, it's a whole marketing gear up.
Oh yeah,
I
yeah.
mean,
So
not to say that it's all, bogus, but I'm always, I pause when I see
yeah,
19 different companies spin up the same thing with different, fancy bottles.
yeah. And I mean, I'm seeing some too that, I don't see a lot of evidence for. I think there's always this kind of view in the supplement company, if you can pack a lot of things into one supplement, that people
Yeah, right.
are getting a lot of value. It's not always the case.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think like from my read of the data, the ones that stand out, certainly the one that stands out on the supplement side is Ficitin.
Yeah.
that a lot of trials on it, multiple different, tissue types. I think both human and a lot of animal studies there. So that one seems to there seems to be something there with Ficitin. I think sometimes what I see with Ficitin is, underdosing of it
That's
in
what I was
certain.
going to bring up. You look at these supplements and you go, is that adequate? I think is something that everyone should always ask about any supplement. And I've noticed that exact same thing about Ficitin.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'd have to look back at the papers with the milligrams per kilogram, but I think when I calculated this out, it would put most people somewhere in the 1,500 milligrams
Right.
to 2,500, 3,000 milligrams, depending on the size of the person.
I think a lot of the supplements that I see on the market are about 800 milligrams. That's stuck in my mind as kind of what I see on average. So,
Yeah.
you'd be thinking about a quadruple dose of that. And they're all expensive also, right? Like
Yeah.
people are selling these Fistin supplements for a lot and they're underdosed. It's like, okay, well, buy this expensive supplement and take 4 times the recommended dose. Like, okay, well, I'm going to go, grow a persimmon tree,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
right?
yeah,
Which
it's
I did, by the way, and I'm very happy about. I've got two in
well, there you go. I mean,
the.
yeah, I do agree. It's sometimes a big sell with these, and I mean, certainly quercetin also is on this list. Most of the time, combined with dasatinib, which is a chemotherapy medication, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
And
So in
so,
the prescription realm rather than the supplement realm. Yeah, I
definitely in
got
the prescription realm. Yeah,
it.
definitely the
Yeah. Have you
prescription.
seen data on risatinib?
Yeah, I mean, they often call this D plus Q because they're almost always combining quercetin and dasatinib.
Mm-hmm.
And there is some data out there. I mean, I remember reading a trial not that long ago that looked at senescence in the kidney,
Uh-huh. Okay.
and I believe they were actually doing biopsies, if I remember
Wow. Yeah,
correctly.
it's pretty hard to beat that data.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
great.
So, that showed, yeah, a decrease in senescent cells after D plus Q for I can't remember how many weeks that they did it, but they did it. A lot of times they're doing, kind of similar to, we won't get into rapamycin today, but similar to rapamycin where you're getting phasic dosing. A lot
Mm.
of times with these senolytics, you're doing phasic dosing as well. You know,
Talk about seasonal eating, right? There's something about the seasonality in the human body that just makes sense to our biology.
yeah, yes, the cycling
Yeah.
definitely makes a lot of sense. Yep, absolutely. So, um,
Have you seen any head-to-head studies on fisetin versus D plus Q versus fasting? I haven't seen any.
I have not. No, I
I
have
mean,
not.
that would be fascinating, right? Because we're in the position of trying to help people make the best choices with their time and money, right? We're like, okay, I want to do longevity. What should I do? What is a waste of time relatively?
Yeah,
Um, and to your, like you were saying, Fistin, D plus Q, there's data for those. Fasting, there's data for those. But then the question becomes, well, should I do them all? Should I do some of them? Should I cycle between them? what's
yeah.
what's your usual approach on that for people for senescent cells?
Yeah, I mean it's really tough because what you're talking about is effect size.
Right.
You can't really, get a good sense of that unless you're comparing head to head. But I mean, given that, as we talked about before, fasting not only is it targeting senescence, but it's also targeting a lot of those other hallmarks. And at least when it comes to the D plus Q, I think there's probably still some safety stuff that's up in
Right.
the air there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't think there is with Ficitin, but yeah, I tend to more go towards the fasting if they're
Yeah.
willing.
I'm in the same boat. And Fistin secondarily. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
The exact
Ficitin.
same reasons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if they're not quite there yet to take that step for fasting, Ficitin could be a good step. Dosing it, first 3 days of the month or something like that, or 3 days every quarter. I don't think there's we need more to work out the optimal regimens here, but yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
phasic dosing for sure.
Well, it'd be nice if there were easier biochemical or blood serum markers to gauge senescence. Like you were saying, they did that study where they're doing kidney biopsies, and it's like, hey, that's great. Well, because it's pretty hard to measure that compellingly without
Yeah.
actually looking at the cells. and everything else is somewhat indirect to my knowledge.
Yeah.
And correct me if there's something I missed there, because I'd love to have a better marker, because then we can start to gather our own data, and say, hey, this individual did one round of 5-day fasting. Here's their pre-post results in, comparable senescent burden. And, in 6 months, we've done Fisetin, 2,400 milligrams, 3 days, pre-post, give it a week's time each side. And then, but yeah, I think that's a huge challenge in all of longevity right now, is that, a lot of it is just not that precise yet. We're getting there. But many of the
Yeah.
tests are even just incredibly expensive, or difficult to repeat, or God forbid someone get a kidney biopsy. I don't even think the real longevity athletes or scientists like Brian Johnson, I don't think he's putting up with biopsies routinely to look at senescence.
Oh, I think he is getting biopsies.
Is he?
I
Oh,
don't think
that's
his
good for
kidneys.
him.
I
Yeah.
don't think he's getting them in his kidneys. I mean, he's definitely dedicated to being a guinea pig of longevity. So
Yeah.
huge respect for that.
Seriously. Yes.
Yeah. But I feel like I feel like I heard he got a muscle biopsy.
Uh-huh. Was he
But
looking
I
like
could
fiber
be wrong.
density, or
What's that?
I feel like I heard that, and he was looking at fiber density particularly.
Oh, could be. Yeah.
But
Yeah. Maybe.
yeah.
Yeah. To your point, he may not have gotten one for senescence.
Come on, Brian, take one for the team. Like,
If anyone can do it,
yeah,
yeah. If
lots
anyone
of
can do
respect to
it,
that
yeah,
guy.
absolutely. Yeah,
Cool.
absolutely.
Okay. So some supplements. We talked about one of the pharmaceuticals. We talked about fasting. That's a pretty good lineup, And I think also, um, both of us have shared the way that we think about approaching that for patients. If you're listening to this and you're going, hey, why don't I do a senescent touch up? Oftentimes, what a reputable practitioner is going to recommend is first minimalist.
Yeah,
Right. And maybe that's just you and me, Dan. We've hung out for a long time. We have similar philosophies. We tend to believe strongly in the human body's ability to self-manage itself. It wants homeostasis.
yeah,
Um, but it also works, to the degree that we know that the simpler things work, and they
yeah,
generally have much more clear safety data.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I think I agree. Fasting, so regular fasting, or using a fasting mimicking diet, a prolon, whatever it may be. Maybe a ketogenic diet has a role here too, particularly if somebody's not open to fasting. And then yeah, Fisetin seems to be the play here. And I'll just add that a lot of times, what I'm looking at too, with although we don't have a direct measure of senescence, a lot of times what I notice is, especially as people get into their 70s and 80s, they just have a low level simmering inflammation that, despite all the food sensitivity testing, gut microbiome, optimizing sleep and exercise and nutrition, and just doing everything we can, using every tool in our toolkit, that HSCRP stays at 1.5 or 2.
That's a huge point. I'm glad you brought that up, because that is maybe one of the uh, main reasons that I get into senescent therapy for my patients.
Yep.
Yeah, and that goes back to the point as well, like, oh, we've identified something basically by ruling everything else out.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely not a substitute. We need, some good blood biomarkers for sure. But I think it can also be, strongly indicative. I mean, certainly, if somebody's in their 70s and 80s, they have senescent cells. And it's highly likely it's this SASP that's just spitting out a lot of inflammation. And, maybe by chopping away at that to some degree, we can get that inflammation to come down a bit.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And if someone's using something like fasting protocols, even if it's a swing and a miss, there's still other benefits of that.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, that's awesome. So I feel like we did a pretty good roundup on senescence. Any other burning questions on that? I feel like that will hopefully be pretty actionable for people.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. All
Awesome.
right. Well, thank you, Dr. Neela Sandel. Again, I'm Dr.
Thank you,
Dan.
Dr. Dan Rodemba.
And yeah, great episode. And we will be meeting again soon.
That sounds great. And for anybody who's looking for more information on this, Dan, are you keeping a YouTube where you putting up lectures or anything? I suppose we should probably shout ourselves out just in case people are looking for info.
Absolutely. Yeah, great point. Yeah, so we're starting a newsletter that's getting going. Hopefully we'll be up and running by the time this is available at drhorzempa.com. I'm Dan Horzempa, MD, at all the socials. Going to start doing more with that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, we just started up a lot of YouTubing. We're really trying to get into the grind on that and put out, useful information for people. So I'm at Neela Sandel MD on YouTube. Okay, guys, catch you next time.
Take care.